Good morning, everybody. I'm very grateful to be here and to talk a little bit about the intersection between immigration and the conservative movement. And in a way, it doesn't fit neatly into the paradigm that Bob set up this morning, because conservatives haven't really decided who they are with respect to immigration. There's really two schools of thought in the movement, and the challenge here and the reason for the failure, if you will, of the conservative movement is that they haven't figured out who they are with respect to immigrants. You see one strain of the conservative movement which sees immigrants as a positive economic and social force. They see hardworking, law-abiding social conservatives. They like them better still if they're willing to work for low wages and if they're uncomfortable receiving government services or preferably ineligible for them. As long as they assimilate and learn English and become like other American immigrant groups, sort of the Wall Street Journal school of thought is kind of the more the merrier. We like them, we'll have as many of them as possible. The Wall Street Journal actually takes the position that the borders of the United States should be absolutely open to anybody who wants to come. So that's one school of thought in the conservative movement. And the other school of thought, which I'm sure you're familiar with because it is very loud over the airwaves certainly, is kind of the more populist Pat Buchanan view. That's the we're under invasion point of view, which is based on fear. It's based on fear of the economic impact of immigrants. It's also a bit of a proxy for a conversation that we're really not having with respect to race and ethnicity and demographic change. It's this notion that immigrants really constitute an invasion which has vast transformative powers on the United States, and that those are negative transformative powers. And at its worst, they portray immigrants, by which usually they mean Mexicans, by which usually they mean that as a proxy for Latinos overall, who have become the nation's largest minority group, as kind of, brown beret wearing, fist in the air, separatist America hating, English rejecting, a community that's, kind of bent on taking back part of the lower 48 for Mexico. So part of the challenge here is that conservatives haven't decided which view they really hold. And there's something for the struggle for the soul of the Republican Party going on between these two groups, and they are really incapable of, at least at the congressional level, the political level, of resisting the temptation to demagogue on these issues as a way of riling up the base. I mean, the assumption is, even if you're a conservative who takes this sort of more pro-immigrant view, that certainly at a time like this one, when we clearly have a problem with a broken immigration system, that it's a really terrific tool for riling people up. It's a really terrific tool for getting people excited about a political issue. This is kind of the Pete Wilson strategy, right? The former governor of California, who was at his lowest point historically in the polls. He was somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 points in the polls, and he wanted to run for re-election. And this is a guy who he was solidly part of the kind of pro-immigrant camp of the conservative movement, who kind of picks up on the fear and tension in California with respect to the presence of undocumented immigrants, runs an ad in the New York Times and the Washington Post saying, we have to do something about this problem. And his poll numbers go up by 30 points overnight. And of course, he can't resist that temptation. He then helps fund the effort to get signatures for what became Proposition 187, the proposition to deny services to undocumented immigrants, services that they were already ineligible for, but then also deny things like public education and public health care services. And he rides that all the way back into the governor's mansion. But at the same time, right, so it had a short-term payoff. But at the same time, it also, captured the notice of a fast-growing Latino community, part of which was immigrant, but the rest of which was also deeply connected to the immigrant community and deeply offended by this rhetoric and this kind of campaign. And we all know what happened, right? The naturalization rates went up by about 500%. And voter registration, voter participation skyrocketed, and what that delivered for California was California's solid now blue state status. The state legislature changed hands. The number of Latinos elected to public office reached an all-time high, and politics in California were forever transformed by this. You would think that would be a strong cautionary tale to the conservative movement, but no. We're obviously going through it again, right? Despite the fact that there's really very well documented public support for this notion that we need a reasonable immigration reform. Last year's House of Representatives leadership could not resist the temptation to try to demagogue this issue, realizing that they were in trouble electorally. They were really hoping to use the immigration issue as a way of getting their base going again. We saw in at least 30 races, incredibly ugly campaign ads and the invention of issues that, Democrats were prepared to deliver Social Security to illegal immigrants, which is a complete fiction, a complete fabrication. And even in states like Arizona, where this issue is at its absolute hottest, it's nowhere hotter than it is in Arizona. Candidates that ran specifically on the immigration issue got pummeled. They got trounced, and they got trounced not just in Arizona, but in the governor's race in Colorado. The chairman of the immigration subcommittee in Indiana lost his seat. It's not working for them. But nevertheless, we have another presidential candidate, Tom Tancredo of the Pat Buchanan School, who seems to forget that Pat Buchanan, topped out at about 5% of the vote. But this is really what characterizes the struggle. And as long as the loudest voices in the Republican Party are the anti-immigrant voices, which are probably less numerous than this sort of pro-immigrant stream, but they're much louder. They characterize who the Republican Party is in the minds not just of immigrant voters, but the much larger group of Latino and Asian voters. The conservative movement is going to have difficulty in realizing its goal, which is to be recruiting heavily from my community, right? Again, they see, and it is true, very strong work ethic, a community which is very attached to faith, very largely Roman Catholic or evangelical. Very strong conservative social values, and they see, I think the Reagan quote is, Latinos are really conservatives, they just don't know it yet. And in all honesty, the progressive movement and the left hasn't quite figured out whether it wants us either. I mean, there is something of this struggle going on also on the left. The conversation about immigration reform, the economic role of immigrants, and the demographic change that's underway in this country has tensions on the left, if we're being honest about it. But even if the conservative movement were to move past this sort of moment of demagoguery, even if the sort of pro-immigrant side of the conversation were to dominate in the future, the conservative movement is still talking out of both sides of its mouth on the immigration issue. And it's, in some ways, this is best captured by the work of Michael Barone, who's really immersed himself in this question and has written a number of books, but which kind of focus on this notion that you can understand immigrants, and Latinos particularly, and you have to understand that most Latinos are natives of the United States, where most of us are not immigrants, but these terms politically become kind of proxies for each other. So he's kind of talking about us when he's talking about immigrants. And his view is that Latinos specifically, you can really understand us by thinking of us as Italian Americans. That's his view. So his thing is, the left thinks of us as black, and that's a mistake, because we're really white, is his view. And therefore, discrimination doesn't really exist. And therefore, you don't really need government interventions. Italian immigrants struggled at the beginning, but then they did fine. And now we don't see them as any different from the rest of us. That's really how you should understand Latinos, he says to his fellow conservatives. Really think of them as white. And if you think of them as white, and the conversation they try to have with us is, you don't need to be part of the civil rights movement. You don't need civil rights policies. You don't need government interventions. You're going to be fine. Just continue to work hard, and it's all going to work out. And we want you to be the poster children for this kind of vision of a country in which the role of government can be small, and you don't really need government intervention to help keep people from being poor or to help lift them out of poverty. And they're trying to suggest that we shouldn't really be part of a civil rights movement, which is, of course, where we very squarely belong and where we are very clearly active and participating. I mean, in some respects, it's true, this is true also of the left, but it's especially true of the conservative movement, is they're having trouble seeing us from outside of this kind of black-white paradigm. And we don't really, there are ways, obviously, in which there are enormous commonalities, particularly, in a country which views race in terms of white and not. We clearly fit in the not category, and certainly our experience in this moment of anti-immigrant demagoguery conforms with that, where you have roadblocks in Georgia which are intended, this is happening now, to pull out people out of their cars if they look like they're Mexican to make sure that they belong in this country. Well, for anybody who's a fifth-generation Mexican-American, that gets a little old, having to demonstrate that you're born in this country. We experience race in a way which has a lot of commonalities with other racial groups in this country. And the conservative movement struggles to step outside of this paradigm and recognize immigrants, and certainly Latinos and Asians, more broadly speaking, as different kinds of constituencies for which a different kind of conversation is appropriate. They need to decide whether or not they think of us as potentially part of their base. I would argue, I think that's true of the progressive movement and the left as well, needs to decide whether you want us and whether or not we're a fit. We're a little bit of a hybrid, and that's part of what kind of creates this tension and this interesting conversation about sort of, if we divide the world in the ways we're typically used to dividing the world, Latinos don't fit cleanly in one side or the other, and immigrants don't fit cleanly in one side or the other. That suggests that there's room for some competition and some real conversation about how do we make this work, how do we make this fit, and where really do we belong? I would argue we belong very squarely in the progressive movement. But there's a conversation there that needs to happen. And the first side to figure out how to engage that conversation in a compelling way, in a way which recognizes the realities of these communities and their needs and engages them in the leadership of getting to our next stage as a country, is going to have a distinct advantage. Thank you.